October 1942. Two armies faced one another across a narrow strip of Egyptian desert, where distance had lost its meaning. At El Alamein, the horizon no longer offered uncertainty or concealment. The ground was flat, measured, and known. Guns were registered. Approaches were plotted. What remained was not opportunity, but inevitability. Behind both lines lay nothing that could absorb failure. To the south, impassable salt marsh and depression sealed the flank. To the north, the Mediterranean closed escape. There was no operational depth left in the desert, only a corridor in which pressure would be applied until something broke. Retreat was no longer a maneuver, it was collapse. For the Axis, this line marked the end of momentum. Months of advance across North Africa had carried Rommel's forces to this position, but no farther. El Alamein was not chosen for advantage. It was accepted from necessity. Beyond it lay Alexandria, the Nile, and strategic consequences Germany could not easily reverse. Yet the battlefield itself offered no generosity, only resistance. Logistics told the deeper truth. Every liter of fuel and every artillery shell traveled across a hostile sea and then hundreds of miles of desert road. Each loss at sea echoed weeks later at the front. Engines stalled, ammunition was rationed. Time itself became an enemy that could not be outflanked. At the moment the line hardened into crisis, Rommel was absent. Ill and exhausted, he'd been forced away just as decisions became irreversible. Command slowed. Assumptions replaced certainty. The system held, but without elasticity. The desert, once an ally to speed and daring, became a trap. Its openness exposed movement instead of concealing it. Distance punished initiative instead of rewarding it. And so, the battle began without motion. No advance, no retreat, only waiting. In that stillness, something fundamental was about to change. Erwin Rommel's reputation in North Africa had been built not on numbers, but on movement. Speed was his currency. Improvisation was his method. Audacity was his signature. Again and again, he had broken larger enemy forces by refusing to fight on their terms, striking before plans could harden and orders could settle. In the desert, hesitation was fatal and Rommel never hesitated. In this environment, momentum replaced mass. Tanks did not wait for perfect coordination. They moved. Columns advanced on instinct, exploiting gaps before they were fully understood. Rommel's campaigns turned time itself into a weapon. Each successful thrust compounded the next, creating a sense that the Axis advance was not merely effective, but inevitable. British defeats reinforced this belief. Repeated reverses in 1941 and early 1942 appeared to confirm German assumptions about their enemy. British formations were outmaneuvered, outpaced, and often outthought. Command structures seemed slow to adapt. Each victory deepened the impression that speed alone could compensate for material weakness. The desert encouraged this conclusion. Its openness punished static defense and rewarded initiative. Wide flanks invited bold movement. Sparse terrain minimized the value of fortifications. In such conditions, preparation seemed secondary to daring. Rommel's methods appeared perfectly suited to the landscape, and the landscape appeared to validate him. But his enemies were learning, not dramatically and not publicly. British commanders studied defeat with care. They recorded patterns, timings, and vulnerabilities. They stopped reacting to Rommel's tempo and began asking why it worked. The learning was quiet, incremental, and easily overlooked by an opponent accustomed to visible collapse. Victory, meanwhile, hardened into assumption. Success bred certainty, and certainty reduced questioning. Rommel's past solutions were carried forward as principles. The belief that speed would always disrupt the British became structural, embedded in planning, posture, and expectation. El Alamein would confront that belief with limits. Here, space was restricted. Movement was predictable. Momentum could be measured and contained. The question was no longer whether Rommel was brilliant, but whether brilliance could function where freedom no longer existed. Early British defeats in North Africa told only part of the story. On the surface, they appeared decisive, columns broken, formations scattered, command confidence shaken. But beneath the visible failures, something slower and less dramatic was taking shape. Each loss was examined, recorded, and absorbed. The British Army was not merely enduring defeat, it was studying it. Those defeats forced reform. Command structures were clarified. Training emphasized coordination rather than reaction. Doctrine shifted away from improvisation and toward repeatable method. The process was neither elegant nor fast, but it was deliberate. Mistakes were no longer treated as aberrations. They became data. Over time, uncertainty was reduced not through brilliance, but through procedure. Patience replaced desperation. British commanders learned that chasing Rommel's movements only amplified his strengths. Each hurried response created new openings for exploitation. Gradually, the instinct to react gave way to the discipline to wait. Time was reclaimed as a resource, rather than surrendered as a liability. The British Army stopped fighting at Rommel's tempo. Instead of pursuing fleeting opportunities, it began shaping conditions. Operations were delayed until supply, intelligence, and fire support aligned. This restraint was often misread as hesitation. In reality, it reflected a growing confidence that control mattered more than speed. Intelligence and logistics began to outweigh maneuver. Signals interception, aerial reconnaissance, and systematic mapping reshaped battlefield awareness. Supply depots were expanded, maintenance cycles were enforced. The British war effort in the desert became less visible but far more resilient. What could not be seen from the front was the accumulation of advantage behind it. Rommel underestimated this transformation. He saw caution where there was calculation. He interpreted stillness as weakness. Past experience encouraged the belief that the British would always fracture under pressure, that they lacked the nerve for sustained confrontation. That belief lingered even as evidence quietly contradicted it. By the autumn of 1942, the Desert War had changed character. It was no longer a contest of rapid movement and daring thrusts. It had become a struggle of preparation, measurement, and endurance. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it would soon determine everything. At the heart of Rommel's thinking lay a conviction shaped by experience. British caution was not discipline, but weakness. He had seen it before hesitation, at critical moments, pauses that invited exploitation. Commanders were reluctant to commit fully. To Rommel, restraint signaled uncertainty. And uncertainty, in war, was an opening. Past victories reinforced this conclusion. Each successful outflanking maneuver, each rapid advance against a slower opponent, appeared to confirm a simple truth. The British could be unbalanced if pressured quickly enough. Time and again, German speed had shattered British cohesion before it could settle. These experiences hardened into expectation, and expectation quietly became doctrine. Rommel anticipated delay, hesitation, and fragmentation. He believed that when confronted with crisis, British command would fracture into competing responses. Units would wait for orders. Opportunities would pass unused. His planning assumed this rhythm. The enemy would blink first, because they always had. That belief shaped the ground itself. Defensive depth was sacrificed for a forward posture intended to deter attack through presence alone. Rommel preferred to hold the enemy at arm's length, to threaten counterstroke rather than absorb pressure. Elastic defense required space, and supply both were scarce. Confidence, however, was abundant. Minefields reflected the same logic. They were extended wide, designed to signal danger rather than absorb sustained assault. They slowed movement, but lacked layered depth. Their purpose was not to stop an enemy determined to break through, but to reinforce the assumption that such determination would never materialize. Reserves told a harsher story. Fuel shortages and strained logistics limited what could be held back. Armored formations were dispersed, committed close to the line, where they could influence the battle immediately. The margin for recovery narrowed. Every decision assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. In this environment, confidence filled the gaps logistics could not. Where supply was thin, belief was thick. Rommel trusted that reputation itself exerted pressure, that the memory of past defeats would weigh on British judgment. He assumed the enemy would continue to fight the war he preferred, not the one they were preparing. But belief, once fixed, resists correction. Evidence that contradicted it was explained away or delayed. Caution was still read as fear. Preparation still looked like passivity. The possibility that the British had changed did not fully register because acknowledging it would have demanded a different kind of defense. At El Alamein, Rommel's core belief would face a test it could not evade. The question was no longer whether the British would hesitate, but whether his assumptions could survive contact with an enemy that had learned to wait. Fuel shortages shaped every German decision long before the first shell fell at El Alamein. Armored formations existed on paper in numbers that could not be sustained in motion. Each kilometer advanced was calculated against what could not be replaced. Tanks were no longer instruments of freedom. They were liabilities that consumed the very resource required to save them. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly, if at all. Losses that might have been absorbed earlier in the campaign now echoed for weeks. A knocked-out tank often remained unreplaced, its absence quietly altering future plans. Mechanical failures were as damaging as enemy fire. Attrition accumulated invisibly, hollowing out formations that still appeared intact from a distance. Italian units bore a disproportionate share of the defensive burden. Under-equipped and often stretched thin, they held sectors that demanded endurance rather than maneuver. Their role was structural, not symbolic. They absorbed pressure that German units could not afford to meet directly. This imbalance deepened the Axis vulnerability, even as it masked it. Rommel gambled on deterrence rather than endurance. His posture assumed that visible strength would prevent a decisive British assault. Forward positions were held to project resolve, not to absorb prolonged attack. The goal was psychological, to convince the enemy that the cost of action would outweigh the benefit. It was a strategy shaped by scarcity. He believed the British would not attack decisively. Past experience suggested hesitation, piecemeal effort, and premature caution. Rommel trusted that this pattern would repeat, that pressure alone would maintain equilibrium. This belief reduced the urgency to prepare for sustained battle. Time was assumed to be on the Axis side. That assumption became structural. Planning, deployment, and logistics were all built around the expectation of restraint from the enemy. Depth was sacrificed. Redundancy was minimized. What could not be replaced was treated as something that would not be tested. El Alamein froze the Axis into place. Movement became risk without reward. Every decision narrowed options rather than expanded them. The line held, but it could not breathe. And in that immobility, the Axis discovered the cost of mistaking belief for security. By the autumn of 1942, British command in North Africa had undergone a fundamental shift. Reaction had given way to preparation. The emphasis was no longer on responding to Rommel's movements, but on shaping the battlefield before he could act. Initiative was redefined not as speed, but as control over when and how the battle would begin. Leadership stressed certainty over improvisation. Orders were simplified. Objectives were limited and clearly defined. Commanders were encouraged to execute plans precisely rather than adapt them impulsively. This approach ran counter to the culture Rommel had exploited, but it produced something he had not faced before: consistency under pressure. The coming battle would be planned, not chased. British forces stopped attempting to outmaneuver Rommel in open desert. Instead, they focused on fixing the Axis in place and applying pressure methodically. Surprise was no longer expected to come from movement, but from scale and persistence. The tempo would be set deliberately and held. Firepower replaced maneuver as the primary tool. Artillery concentrations were calculated in advance, with schedules that prioritized continuity over brilliance. Infantry advances were tied to barrages, measured in yards and minutes. Armor was committed not for exploitation, but for reinforcement. The battlefield became an equation rather than a contest of nerve. The desert itself was transformed through preparation. It was mapped, measured, and rehearsed. Training grounds replicated terrain. Routes were marked. Timings were tested repeatedly. What had once appeared empty and unpredictable became known and controlled. The British Army turned the desert from a space of improvisation into one of execution. Rommel dismissed these changes as cosmetic. He saw drills where he expected rigidity. He interpreted planning as an inability to adapt. From his perspective, the British were preparing to fight the last battle they had lost slowly and defensively. The deeper shift went unrecognized. That misreading would prove decisive. By mistaking preparation for weakness, Rommel overlooked the possibility that the British no longer needed to react at all. They were building a battle in which reaction would be irrelevant, and once it began, there would be little room left to recover. By the time the British offensive took shape, uncertainty had been deliberately reduced. Planning replaced assumption. Variables were isolated, measured, and controlled wherever possible. The aim was not to eliminate friction, war never allowed that, but to narrow it until surprise lost its power. What emerged was a battle designed to function even when things went wrong. Mine clearing became an industrial process. Lanes were plotted in advance, equipment standardized, procedures rehearsed until they became mechanical. Engineers worked forward under fire, not as improvisers, but as components in a larger system. Progress was slow, visible, and relentless. Each cleared path was less a breakthrough than a calculation completed. Artillery was massed with a density the desert had never seen. Guns were no longer distributed for flexibility, but concentrated for effect. Fire plans were drawn down to the minute. Shells allocated by phase rather than by opportunity. Barrages did not seek surprise. They sought certainty. The goal was not to shock the enemy into collapse, but to grind resistance down methodically. Timetables replaced intuition. Advances were measured in yards, pauses in minutes. Infantry moved when the schedule dictated, not when opportunity seemed to appear. Armor followed when conditions were confirmed, not when instinct urged pursuit. This rigidity was deliberate. It ensured that momentum did not outrun support, and that initiative remained collective, not individual. In this environment, Rommel's style found no room to breathe. His strength had always been in sensing weakness and exploiting hesitation, but there was little hesitation to exploit. The British were not reacting to his moves. They were executing their own. The battlefield offered no gaps that had not already been anticipated. As a result, his strengths became increasingly irrelevant. Tactical brilliance could not compensate for the absence of fuel, reserves, or time. Counterstrokes stalled before they developed. Decisions arrived too late to alter outcomes already scheduled. Rommel was no longer shaping events. He was responding to them, one calculation behind. The battlefield now favored preparation over flair. Success was determined less by boldness than by endurance, less by inspiration than by alignment. It was a form of warfare that rewarded patience and punished improvisation. For the first time in the Desert Campaign, genius was not an advantage. And as the British method pressed forward, steadily and without illusion, it became clear that this was no longer Rommel's kind of war. The question was not whether he could adapt, but whether adaptation was still possible at all. By the time the battle approached its decisive phase, British intelligence had begun to penetrate Axis intentions with increasing clarity. This was not the result of a single revelation, but of accumulation patterns assembled over time. Habits mapped, routines observed. Knowledge did not arrive dramatically. It settled gradually, shaping expectations long before it shaped action. Signals interception and aerial reconnaissance reshaped British awareness of the battlefield. Radio traffic revealed shifts in emphasis and moments of strain. Reconnaissance aircraft traced vehicle movement, supply routes, and defensive preparation. Each fragment alone was incomplete, but together they formed a picture of constraint. The Axis was holding but narrowly. Rommel lacked equivalent visibility. His intelligence picture was thinner, slower, and often reactive. Fuel shortages limited reconnaissance flights. Intercept capability was uneven. Reports arrived late, or filtered through assumption. What could not be confirmed was often inferred, and inference, under pressure, favored familiarity over accuracy. German assumptions filled the gaps. British caution was still interpreted as reluctance. Preparatory movement was read as defensive adjustment. The absence of immediate action reinforced the belief that the enemy remained hesitant. In reality, the British were already committed to a timetable that did not require visibility to proceed. Deception played its part. British measures fixed Axis attention forward, reinforcing expectations of limited engagement and localized probing. Feints and false preparations suggested containment rather than breakthrough. Rommel's focus remained where it had always been, on countering movement, not absorbing pressure. As a result, Rommel prepared for the wrong kind of fight. His defenses were oriented toward disruption rather than endurance. He anticipated maneuver and countermaneuver, not sustained assault. Reserves were positioned to respond quickly, not to survive attrition. The structure of his defense reflected belief more than evidence. The imbalance widened silently. British planners operated with growing certainty. German commanders operated with growing confidence in assumptions that no longer held. One side reduced illusion through verification. The other relied on experience that no longer applied. Neither imbalance announced itself until action made concealment impossible. When the moment came, The British would not need surprise. They already possessed understanding, and understanding, quietly accumulated, would soon prove more decisive than speed ever had. Axis soldiers at El Alamein fought with discipline and resolve. Along the line, German and Italian units endured bombardment, heat, and exhaustion without collapse. Positions were held under sustained pressure. Orders were followed precisely. Morale, though strained, did not evaporate. In the narrow corridor of the front, courage remained intact even as circumstances deteriorated. But courage could not compensate for fuel shortages. Tanks that survived the opening barrages often lacked the petrol to maneuver decisively. Vehicles moved when ordered and then stopped, engines silent, waiting for supplies that could not arrive in time. What should have been mobile counterattacks became static gestures, brave but incomplete. Counterattacks stalled without momentum. Units advanced into fire, gained ground measured in hundreds of meters, and then froze. Without fuel to exploit success or artillery to suppress resistance, progress became temporary. Each effort cost men and machines that could not be replaced. The desert, once open to exploitation, now closed around them. Losses accumulated faster than replacements. Damaged tanks were cannibalized rather than repaired. Crews were reassigned, formations thinned. Italian units, already stretched, absorbed increasing pressure. The arithmetic of attrition favored the attacker not because the Axis lacked skill, but because it lacked depth. Time worked relentlessly against them. As losses mounted, Rommel's command options narrowed. Every decision carried risk without corresponding opportunity. To counterattack was to spend fuel that might be needed tomorrow. To hold position was to invite further attrition. To withdraw was to concede ground that could not be retaken. Choice itself became constrained. Tactical brilliance met strategic suffocation. Rommel continued to issue precise, energetic orders. Local successes were achieved. British units were delayed, disrupted, sometimes repelled. But these moments no longer altered the trajectory of the battle. Skill could no longer overcome the structural imbalance shaping every engagement. The desert ceased to reward daring. What had once amplified boldness now punished exposure. Movement drew fire. Concentration invited bombardment. Initiative triggered response already planned and already supplied. The environment that had once magnified Rommel's strengths now neutralized them. By this stage, defeat was not dramatic. It was cumulative. It arrived not as collapse, but as exhaustion. The Axis line still existed, but it no longer threatened. Courage remained, but courage alone could not restore momentum. And as the pressure continued, steady and unrelenting, the question was no longer whether the Axis could hold, but how long courage could endure when nothing else could move. The offensive opened without ambiguity. When the first guns fired, they shattered every lingering assumption of restraint. This was not a probing attack or a limited demonstration. The scale alone made that clear. Across the line, artillery erupted in a coordinated barrage, designed not to surprise, but to overwhelm. The desert, long, silent, became saturated with sound and concussion. Artillery fire redefined the battlefield. Shells fell in patterns calculated weeks in advance, striking command posts, gun lines, and supply routes with methodical precision. The ground itself seemed to convulse. Trenches collapsed. Minefields detonated prematurely under bombardment. For Axis defenders, there was no safe depth, only exposure measured in seconds. Axis defenses absorbed damage without relief. Positions held through discipline and training, but there was no pause in the fire and no rotation out of danger. Units endured hour after hour of bombardment with little ability to respond. Ammunition was conserved. Communications faltered. The structure of the defense remained, but its capacity to react steadily eroded. Rommel returned to command amid crisis. Summoned back as the scale of the assault became undeniable, he arrived to find a battle already in motion and largely beyond redirection. Reports describe sustained pressure, not isolated thrusts. The offensive was unfolding exactly as planned by the enemy. Immediate countermeasures failed. Armored units committed piecemeal, lacked fuel and freedom of movement. Counterattacks stalled under artillery, fire, and air attack before they could gather momentum. The familiar tools of disruption, speed, surprise, and localized superiority found no purchase in a battlefield designed to deny them. The initiative now belonged firmly to the British. They dictated tempo, scale, and direction. Axis responses became reactive, aimed at limiting loss rather than regaining control. Each hour that passed deepened the imbalance. The battle no longer pivoted on opportunity, but on endurance. The turning point was irreversible. Even as the Axis line held in places, the logic of the battle had shifted. Resources were being spent faster than they could be replaced. Decisions narrowed. Time ceased to offer recovery. El Alamein was no longer a contest of maneuver. It had become a test of survival. And as the guns continued, steady and unrelenting, it became clear that the desert had chosen its side. What followed would not restore balance, but confirm its loss. Rommel attempted counteroffensives without fuel. Orders were issued with urgency, but the means to carry them out no longer existed. Armored units moved forward as commanded, engines burning through reserves measured in hours, not days. What followed was not exploitation, but arrest momentum expended before contact could be decisive. Units advanced and stopped within the same hour. Gains were registered on maps and then erased by reality. Vehicles halted in exposed positions, unable to reposition or withdraw without assistance that could not arrive. Crews waited under fire, aware that movement itself had become a finite resource. British air power sealed movement corridors. Supply roads, assembly areas, and approach routes were observed and struck repeatedly. Daylight movement became hazardous. Columns dispersed or froze, further disrupting coordination. The air no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to the side that could sustain pressure continuously. As conditions deteriorated, decisions became reactive rather than creative. Rommel's earlier campaigns had been defined by anticipation, by acting before the enemy could respond. At El Alamein, he was forced into response after response, each narrower than the last. Initiative was no longer seized, it was denied. German command cohesion strained under the weight of sustained assault. Communications were interrupted. Subordinate commanders acted on incomplete information. Coordination between German and Italian units became increasingly difficult as losses mounted and supply disparities widened. The system still functioned, but without flexibility. Withdrawal was delayed too long. Strategic logic argued for disengagement before collapse, but hope lingered that the line might still stabilize. Each day of delay consumed irreplaceable resources. What might have been an organized retreat became a forced response to mounting pressure. Attrition replaced maneuver entirely. The battle no longer shifted through bold movement or sudden opportunity. It ground forward through exhaustion, bombardment, and depletion. The Axis line thinned, not dramatically, but decisively. By the time reality fully asserted itself, the battle's outcome had already been written. What remained was not the question of victory, but of survival, and how much could be saved once the desert stopped offering second chances. British forces achieved penetration not through sudden rupture, but through sustained pressure applied without pause. For days, the assault had compressed the Axis line, eroding its ability to respond. When the breakthrough came, it was the product of exhaustion rather than surprise. The front yielded because it could no longer absorb strain. Axis lines fractured rather than collapsed. Defensive positions gave way unevenly, opening narrow corridors that widened under continued pressure. Units withdrew locally while others remained engaged, creating gaps that could not be sealed. Commanders struggled to re-establish coherence as the battle shifted from defense to escape. Rommel ordered retreat under worsening conditions. The decision came late, shaped as much by necessity as by strategy. Withdrawal routes were exposed, congested, and contested. What should have been a controlled movement became a race against attrition. Time, once Rommel's ally, now worked against him. Equipment was abandoned to save manpower. Tanks without fuel, guns without transport, vehicles damaged but repairable. These were left behind to preserve crews. Each abandoned machine marked a permanent loss, not just of material, but of future possibility. Survival replaced resistance as the priority. The desert reversed its verdict. The openness that had once enabled rapid advance now exposed retreat. Air attack and artillery punished movement. Dust clouds betrayed columns. The environment that had rewarded speed now punished it, turning distance into vulnerability. Speed now favored the pursuer. British forces advanced with supply lines intact and objectives clearly defined. What had been methodical became mobile. The balance of initiative reversed completely. For the first time in the campaign, it was the Axis reacting to British movement rather than the other way around. North Africa's balance shifted permanently. El Alamein did not merely break a line, it altered the trajectory of the theater. The Axis retreat would continue, step by step, across ground once conquered with confidence. And as the desert watched the columns pull back, one truth became unavoidable. Momentum, once lost, rarely returns on its own. El Alamein ended Erwin Rommel's aura of inevitability. For nearly 2 years, his presence in North Africa had suggested a constant imbalance, an impression that speed, intuition, and daring could always bend events back in his favor. That perception did not vanish in a single moment, but at El Alamein it fractured beyond repair. The battle demonstrated, with quiet finality, that reputation could no longer substitute for advantage. The Axis lost the strategic initiative in Africa, not through collapse, but through reversal. From this point forward, German and Italian forces would react rather than dictate. Their movements became shaped by pressure instead of opportunity. The rhythm of the campaign changed. What followed El Alamein was no longer a contest for dominance, but a prolonged retreat measured in fuel, distance, and time. For the British, confidence hardened into doctrine. Victory validated method. Planning, logistics, and coordination were no longer seen as compensations for weakness, but as sources of strength in their own right. Lessons learned under pressure were preserved and formalized. El Alamein became proof that discipline could defeat audacity if applied with patience and scale. German command reassessed its assumptions too late. Reports acknowledged the transformation of British capability, but recognition did not restore lost position. Structural problems, supply, distance, and numerical inferiority could not be corrected in the midst of withdrawal. Adaptation required time the Axis no longer possessed. Insight arrived after consequence. Logistics emerged as the decisive factor. The battle revealed what maneuver had concealed, that supply determined endurance, and endurance determined outcome. Fuel shortages, replacement delays, and overstretched lines were not peripheral constraints. They were central forces shaping the war. El Alamein did not invent this reality. It exposed it. As a result, the Desert War became industrial. Battles were no longer decided by rapid thrusts alone, but by sustained output artillery tonnage, vehicle availability, repair capacity, and logistical throughput. Victory depended on systems rather than individuals. War in North Africa had crossed a threshold. In this environment, genius alone was no longer sufficient. Skill still mattered. Leadership still mattered. But brilliance without structure could not prevail against preparation reinforced by supply. El Alamein marked the moment when the desert stopped amplifying individual talent and began enforcing collective capacity. The myth did not disappear overnight. Rommel remained respected, even admired. But the spell was broken. From El Alamein onward, the campaign would unfold according to material balance rather than momentum. The desert had rendered its judgment not on courage, but on sustainability. And as the war moved westward, one truth followed every mile of retreat. The age of improvisation in North Africa had ended, replaced by a war that rewarded those who could endure longer than their enemy. Rommel underestimated the British capacity to learn. His earlier victories had encouraged a view of the enemy as slow to adapt, bound by caution and institutional inertia. Defeat, in this reading, confirmed weakness rather than provoking change. Yet beneath the surface of earlier failures, the British Army had been absorbing lessons with discipline and intent. What Rommel dismissed as persistence was, in fact, evolution. He misread preparation as passivity. Weeks of limited movement, visible caution, and deliberate pacing reinforced his belief that the British lacked the nerve for decisive action. Stillness appeared to confirm hesitation, but this calm concealed activity of a different kind: planning, rehearsal, and accumulation. The absence of motion was not a pause, it was a buildup. Rommel overvalued speed in an environment that no longer rewarded it. The desert had once magnified rapid movement, but at El Alamein, space was constrained and frontages fixed. The corridor between sea and depression limited maneuver. Speed could no longer create surprise where every approach was known. Yet Rommel continued to plan as though momentum itself could still alter geometry. Structural weakness was masked by reputation. Past success had generated confidence that filled gap supply could not. Fuel shortages, thin reserves, and overstretched logistics were tolerated because belief suggested they could be managed through audacity. The image of inevitability softened scrutiny. risk became habit. Habit became assumption. El Alamein exposed systemic limits that reputation had concealed. When sustained pressure replaced fleeting opportunity, the Axis system could not compensate. The structure supporting Rommel's methods, mobility, surprise, elasticity, collapsed under conditions it had never been designed to endure. What failed was not courage or competence, but compatibility between method and environment. Respect for the enemy came too late. Recognition of British transformation arrived only after commitment had become unavoidable. By the time Rommel acknowledged the scale of preparation facing him, his options had already narrowed beyond recovery. Adaptation requires time. At El Alamein, time no longer existed. The price was strategic defeat, not merely a lost battle, but the loss of initiative across an entire theater. What Rommel misjudged was not a single decision or disposition, but the nature of modern war itself as it was changing around him. And in that realization lay the deeper lesson of El Alamein. That victory belongs not to those who win fastest, but to those who learn sooner and endure longer than their enemy. Erwin Rommel remained a skilled commander after El Alamein. His understanding of terrain, his ability to read tactical situations, and his instinct for movement did not vanish with defeat. But what changed was relevance. The qualities that had once made him decisive now mattered less than the conditions surrounding them. Skill endured. Influence did not. The war had moved beyond his preferred conditions. North Africa was no longer a theater defined by open flanks and fleeting opportunity. It had become a constrained environment shaped by logistics, firepower, and endurance. Decisions were no longer won in hours, but absorbed over weeks. The space for improvisation narrowed until it disappeared entirely. El Alamein marked the triumph of method over motion. It demonstrated that planning, supply, and coordination could neutralize even the most agile opponent. Momentum, once the defining currency of desert warfare, lost its power when confronted with sustained preparation. Movement without depth became exposure. Speed without supply became liability. For the British, victory reshaped confidence across the Allied world. El Alamein was not merely a tactical success, it was psychological confirmation that the Axis could be confronted directly and defeated methodically. The belief that German commanders were inherently superior was broken. From that moment, Allied planning expanded in scale and ambition. History remembers Rommel's brilliance and its limits. He remains studied not because he failed, but because his failure revealed something enduring about war. Talent can exploit opportunity, but it cannot manufacture conditions indefinitely. When the environment changes, methods must change with it, or they become artifacts of an earlier phase. War punishes those who fight the last battle too well. Rommel had mastered a form of warfare that rewarded audacity, tempo, and intuition. At El Alamein, those virtues were not wrong, but they were insufficient. The battlefield had evolved. The system had changed. Adaptation came too slowly to bridge the gap. He believed speed would always save him. In the desert, it often had. Speed had turned retreat into advance and weakness into leverage. But at El Alamein, the desert refused to move. It offered no space to exploit, no margin to recover. It demanded endurance instead of daring. That refusal marked the end of an era. The North African campaign did not end Rommel's career, but it defined its boundary. From that point on, war would be decided less by individual brilliance than by collective capacity. Momentum, once lost, could not simply be regained by will alone. And so El Alamein stands as a quiet verdict, not against courage or genius, but against the belief that they are timeless. The desert had changed, the war had changed, and those who could not change with it were left behind, watching history move forward without them.